Good evening. My name is John Burns. I'm the pastor of the University Baptist Church in College Park, Maryland. And this is our once a week YouTube Bible study. Last week we finished up a study on the book of Philemon. And tonight we begin a new 7-week study called Prayers in Difficult Days. We're going to look at 7 prayers from the New and Old Testament prayed by people who were going through difficult days to try to learn how we can better talk to God in the days that we're facing right now. Tonight, we're going to look at a prayer by Hagar. And then next week, we'll look at a prayer by Job. And in the following weeks, we'll look at prayers by Hannah, by Nehemiah, by Jeremiah, by Daniel, and by the first century church in the book of Acts. I hope you'll join us to look through this as we go and learn more about praying in difficult days. I don't know if you've had this experience yet, but I had it last week. I woke up and I thought I had a sore throat and I thought maybe I was sniffling a little bit. And then I felt warmish and I thought, oh, here we go. And then I started thinking, oh, I bought an iced coffee at Dunkin' Donuts last week, and I don't know if I used hand sanitizer before I drank it. And then I also went into Target and I wore my mask and I stayed 6 feet apart. I had to get some things that we needed at the house, but maybe I touched something and I don't remember if I washed my hands when I got home, and I began to replay every step of the way. And I was having company come in this weekend, and so I went to praying. I started saying, Lord, don't let me get this virus right now. I don't ever want it, but don't let me get it. I'm old. I'll be one of those at-risk age group. And I prayed with probably more fervency, more passion than I've prayed about this virus before. And then as a few days went by, I didn't have a fever and I wasn't sniffling, and my sore throat seemed to be allergy related, and everything got back to normal, and I didn't pray with quite so much passion. I'm afraid that's sort of the way human nature is. When do you find that you pray best? When you're afraid? When you're worried? Maybe when you're sad? Or maybe when you're happy? Maybe you pray best when everything's peaceful around you, or maybe you really get down to praying when there's turmoil. I don't know how you pray best. In this story tonight, we have a woman who is praying out of desperation. She has been mistreated. She doesn't know what she's going to do. And she's not just praying for herself, she's praying for the life of her child. And that usually gets us in a different state of mind, doesn't it? When our children or our parents or somebody we love is facing some kind of dangerous situation, or we don't really know how they're doing in a situation, or we're worried about the situations they're going to get themselves into, that's when we pray with the most passion. We're going to see some of that in tonight's study as we look in the book of Genesis. And we're going to begin in the 16th chapter of Genesis, if you have a Bible. And you can hope that maybe I'll learn how to be more tech savvy and put up the passages so everybody can see them. I might get there, but I'm not there tonight. So I'll have to read you the passage, and you can follow along in Genesis 16. We're going to begin with verse 4. This follows a conversation that happened between Abraham and Sarah. They had been promised a child, but years, decades had gone by, and Sarah had not conceived a child, and she was far beyond the years when women conceive children. And so she kind of concluded this just wasn't going to happen. God wasn't going to keep God's promises, or maybe they had misunderstood God's promises. I don't know. She went to Abraham and said, you go ahead and have sexual relations with my servant Hagar. and maybe she can bear you a child. Now, this is so foreign to the way we think today, but in the days of Abraham and Sarah, these patriarchal societies, men often had more than one wife, and they also often had sexual relations with servants and concubines, all sorts of things that went on in those days. And so this is not an unusual occurrence. It's just a sad occurrence that Sarah was not able to conceive the child for Abraham. And so she gave him her servant Hagar. It's a sad thing for Hagar. She's not said to be loving towards Abraham or have any kind of affection for him, and yet this is her duty as a slave. They do have sexual relations, Abraham and Hagar, and as a result, Abraham and Hagar, right? And as a result, a child is born, Ishmael. And when Ishmael is born, Sarah, who really instigated this whole plan, begins to have ill will towards Hagar, and she says that Hagar looks at her with contempt, as if she's better than Sarah. Of course, that's not going to go over well, and that's where we pick up the story. Sarah is having a conversation with Abraham about Hagar and how Hagar looks at her now that Hagar has been able to have a child and Sarah still has not. We read in the 4th verse that Abraham went into Hagar and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. Then Sarah said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my slave girl to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked at me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." But Abram said to Sarah, "Your slave girl is in your power. Do to her as you please." Then Sarah dealt harshly with her, and she ran away from her. Newer translations tell us that Sarah beat her. This is sort of a glossing over of what happened, but Sarah beat Hagar, and Hagar ran off. We continue the story. The angel of the Lord found Hagar by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, slave girl of Sarah, where have you come from, and where are you going?" She said, "I am running away from my mistress Sarah." And the angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit to her." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "I am also going to greatly multiply your offspring, that they cannot be counted for multitude." And the angel of the Lord said to her, "Now you have conceived and shall bear a son. You shall call him Ishmael, for the Lord has given him to your affliction. He shall be a wild ass of a man, with his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he shall live at odds with all of his kin." So she named the Lord who spoke to her, "You are El-roi." For she said, "Have I really seen God and remained alive after seeing him?" So she has this encounter with the angel of the Lord after getting beaten by Sarah. And the angel says, God's going to bless you with this son that you have conceived. He's going to be the father of a lot of offspring. He's going to be kind of a rough one, though, and he's going to have problems and fight and be rather violent. But then he will produce this great amount of offspring. They will become a great nation. Now, we believe today that Ishmael's descendants became followers of the religion of Islam. Both the Islamic people and the Jewish people trace their heritage back through Abraham. The Jewish folks through Abraham. The Jewish folks through Isaac, and the Islamic believers through Ishmael. When she's desperate, Hagar, out there in the wilderness, the Lord speaks to her, comforts her, and tells her to go back and to serve as a slave to Sarah. And Hagar's takeaway from this encounter was that she had seen God and had remained alive. It was a strong belief in those days that if you ever saw God, you couldn't live. It would be too much for you. You'd be sort of incinerated or killed by the glory of God. But here now, Hagar has seen God, and so she names God. She names him the God who sees. Some translation says he's the God that I saw, but that's not what El Roi means. El Roi means the God who sees. What she really said was, God saw me and my trials, my difficulties, my despair. God saw me and responded. As far as we know, Hagar is the only person to ever name God. God names God's self and reveals that name to Moses and to many others, but only Hagar gives God a name, and she names him the God who sees. I hope that's somewhat comforting to you and an encouragement in your prayer life that when we talk to God, we're talking to a God who sees us. Sometimes when life gets rough and we get in those difficult days, we begin to think maybe God is not paying attention. If God was paying attention, I'm sure we'd get some help, or I'm sure my situation would change. And yet it remains a very bleak kind of situation. And yet this reminds us, this story, that God always sees. Our God is a God who sees us in our difficulties. But Hagar's problems didn't end there. She didn't go back to Abraham and Sarah and find a new sense of acceptance and welcoming and a family and live for happily ever after. I'm afraid that's in fairy tales, not in biblical tales. So we go back to see that down the road, as you well know, Sarah does become with child. God keeps the promise to Sarah, and she conceives Isaac. And for a while, you have Isaac and Ishmael, the son of Sarah and the son of Hagar, living in the same compound, maybe not under the same tent roof, but in the same vicinity as part of the same family. But where we pick up tonight's story, we find that Sarah is not really liking the fact that Ishmael is growing up side by side with Isaac. We find this in the 21st chapter of Genesis. We're going to pick up the 8th verse there. It says, the child grew and was weaned. And Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. Evidently, this day when a child is weaned from his mother was a rite of passage that was marked in Hebrew households with great feast or parties. It wasn't quite a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah, but it had that kind of glow to it that we're going to recognize this child is growing up. Let's read on in verse 9. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. So she said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman with her son. For the son of this slave woman shall not inherit along with my son Isaac. Now this matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you. For it is through Isaac that offspring shall be named for you. As for the son of this slave woman, I will make a nation of him also, because he too is your offspring. So we have a sense of jealousy maybe on the part of Sarah, or maybe it's just about who's going to inherit. You know, I've been a pastor long enough to know that when somebody dies, families who can get along pretty well otherwise often get crosswise over the money or over the possessions or over who's going to inherit what. Sometimes what they're inheriting doesn't matter to much at all financially, or the price is almost nothing, and yet they'll fight over that. That's the way we are as people. We want everything, and Sarah wanted everything. She didn't want Ishmael to inherit from Abraham's wealth. She didn't want to have to watch Ishmael and Hagar. She was resentful of the whole relationship, so she told Abraham to send them away. And Abraham didn't want to. I mean, this is his son. Ishmael is his son. He wants to keep everybody together. But God says, that's not going to work out here. So don't worry about him. He's your son. I'm going to look after him. I'm going to be with him. And I'm going to be with Isaac as well, the boy who stays with you. And so we continue with the story in verse 14, where it says, and Abraham rose up early in the morning. Well, every time Abraham rises up early in the morning, there's going to be drama. The next time we see this is when Abraham understands God to tell him to sacrifice Isaac, and he rises up early in the morning. Well, this day he's rising up early in the morning to do another very, very sad deed. Let's read on. He took bread and a skin of water, and he gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot. For she said, do not let me look on the death of this child. And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. One of the saddest scenes in all of Scripture. Abraham has given her some water and some bread and sent her out into the wilderness, where she went with her baby on her back, wrapped in a huge, it's almost like a scarf, but it's bigger than a scarf, a huge piece of fabric that wrapped around and over her shoulders and held the baby on her back. And she's taken care of this baby, but evidently she's been out in the wilderness now so long that she's out of water, she's out of food, the sun is bearing down on them, and she realizes this infant cannot survive much longer. And she can't bear to watch her own son die. So she places him under a bush, a little bit of shade that she can find, and gets far enough away from him that she doesn't have to hear him cry, and she doesn't have to witness his death. And as she sits away from him, she lifts up her voice to God and cries a prayer of tears, weeping to God. What a sad sight. I don't know if you've ever had a situation that was so dramatic, so painful, so frightening, so fearful, that all you could do was cry your prayer. You didn't know what to say. Well, if you've been in that situation, you can understand this prayer in difficult days, because she has no words. She just cries out to God. And she's not the only one crying out to God. For in verse 17 it says, and God heard the voice of the boy. And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Now, some people read that as, again, a paternalistic, that this is all about the male domination of society, that God did not hear Hagar, but did hear the boy because he's male and she's female. And I guess that might have been part of the fabric of this story. But I choose to think that God hears the voice of children, and that God has a special ear turned towards those children who cry out. I sure hope that's true, that God responds to children. Jesus said God did, that God has angels watching over every child, and I trust that that is true. I think it's because that Ishmael was just a child. He cried out, and God heard and went to his mother and assured Hagar, I've heard him. Everything's going to be all right. I'm listening. I'm paying attention. I've got a plan. He's got a future. I'm working these things out. In verse 18, God says, come, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water, and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy, and he grew up, and he lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt. So we see that Ishmael, he begins the whole nation of Egypt. She finds a wife from those people, and he continues that work, and this becomes a great nation, just like Isaac's descendants are going to become a great nation that we know as the Hebrew people. There was a Islamic woman by the name of Moha Kaf, and she wrote a little poem that I found kind of humorous but also insightful. This is completely imaginary, but I'm going to read the poem to you because it sort of accents all that's going on between these two women, Sarah and Hagar. It's got a funny title. It says, Hagar writes a cathartic letter to Sarah as an exercise suggested by her therapist. Here's the little letter. Dear Sarah, life made us enemies, but it doesn't have to be that way. What if we both ditched the old man? He could have visitation rights with the boys, alternate weekends and holidays. Yeah, especially he could come see him on the Feast of Sacrifice. Everybody's forgotten that one anyway. That it began with me abandoned in the desert, watching my baby dehydrate for days. I dared God to let us die. Anyway, you and I, we could set up house. We could raise the kids, start a catering business maybe. You have brains and so do I. We could travel. There are places to see besides and this Nowheresville desert we're in. We could get out of this place with all these tribes and hooligans. No, your lips always thin when you disapprove of me, like the mother I can barely remember from before I wound up in your house. I was barely more than a girl. You are the one who brought me here from Egypt. You used to laugh back then, Sarah. In those days, you could bear to look at me. Oh, Sarah, you need years of therapy. Can't you admit that what you did to me was cruel? Admit it for just 1 second. It won't make you hate him forever, just long enough to know the world won't fall apart, just long enough to pity him, to find yourself, to laugh again, Sarah, to breathe. Imagine God. Ah, the possibility. Sincerely, love, Hagar. Well, it's a funny way of writing things, but there is some stuff in there that kind of appeals to me. Hagar reminding Sarah of the days when you used to laugh, when you could bear to look at me, when you brought me here and we were close. But life has changed Sarah. Life has made her rather petty in her own way. She's bitter at times. She doesn't laugh so much anymore, and she takes out her emotions on this poor slave girl who can barely remember her mother. But even then, in this fictitious letter, Hagar's holding out the possibility that maybe there could be reconciliation. Maybe we could both find God. Maybe we could both live in peace and be harmonious. It's an interesting way of looking at things. I also am struck by this statement in this poem where she says, can't you just admit that you've been cruel to me? Oh, wouldn't so many things in life be resolved if we could just admit what we've done to the other person? That we have been cruel, that we have been petty, that we have been selfish, that we have been angry, or we have been anxious, or we have been fearful. If we didn't just put up those false fronts and try to pretend that everything's fine with me, it's you who are the problem, oh, we could have so much reconciliation in this world. It could be a better place to live. In this poem, that's what Hagar is going for. But Sarah disapproves. Her lips get thin. She won't go along with it. Well, I don't know how much to give to that poem, but I do know that in this prayer of Hagar, I am moved. She's trying to connect with God over the survival of her child, and she does it with such passion she can't even find the words. Have you ever prayed a prayer of tears? A prayer where you couldn't find the words? You didn't know what to say to God? Everything you thought of didn't quite express the true depths of your heart? That's the prayer Hagar prayed. And Ishmael, he wasn't even verbal. So he didn't know a vocabulary to say to God, but in his own heart as an infant, he cried out to God, and God heard. God hears our prayers, even our prayers without words. Even when we are so desperate we don't know what to say, God sees and hears us. It reminds me of a passage from Romans 8, where Paul writes, "Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weaknesses. For we do not know how to pray as we ought, but that very Spirit intercedes with us with sighs too deep for words. And God, who searches the heart, knows what is the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God." If you don't know what to say in your prayer, like sometimes I don't, that's okay, because the Holy Spirit is talking to our spirit. And that spirit intercedes with God with words that are too deep for us to even comprehend. The Spirit reveals the deepest part of our soul and our heart and our passion and our longing, and God hears it. Have you ever prayed when you felt mistreated? Hagar felt like she had been treated unjustly, and she cried out to God for help. In his book, Fearfully and Wonderfully Made, Dr. Paul Brand talks about an episode he had when he worked in the only leper colony in the United States. That colony is closed now. It used to exist in Carville, Louisiana. It was run by a bunch of Catholic nuns who would send supplies in on barges and try to keep away from the residents there. But Dr. Paul Brand, he lived there, and he helped these folks for years and years and years. And one night he was getting ready to go to bed, and he walked and he scuffled across the floor, and he almost felt, because the bottom of his feet felt numb. He began to think, oh, that's how leprosy begins. That's why the extremities of people with the disease are often scarred, because they can't feel anything. They don't know when they're hurting or destroying or damaging their feet or their hands. He felt the numbness in his feet. The next night, the numbness was still there. The next day, the numbness was still there. And he began to fear. Paul Brand did. He said he began to fear, oh, I've got this disease. And then he began to feel rage against God. He thought, after all my life, after all I've given to help sick people, you're going to give me the disease? And he was praying one night. He prayed and he prayed. He didn't know what to say to God. He was so angry. And he took a needle and he poked it in the bottom of his foot in one little act of desperation to see if the numbness had gone deeper into his foot. And when he poked that needle in his foot, he felt pain, and he howled in pain. And he said it was a prayer of howling to God. And God reassured him that he had just walked too far a couple of days before that, and he had some calluses building up, and his feet were numb, but he did not, in fact, have leprosy. Dr. Paul Brand talked often about howling to God when he had no words to express his heart. Maybe sometimes we just have to howl to God. I would think these first responders and nurses and healthcare workers that get sick with the coronavirus, I would think they would howl to God. I would think they would pray out to God in deep passion about the injustice of all of this. And this story tells me that if they do, God sees, and God hears, and God responds. And God will do the same for you and for me when we pray in these difficult days. So I encourage you, maybe this week something's going to come along and it will affect you deeply, and you won't know exactly how to put the prayer into words. Remember Hagar. She didn't know what to say either, and yet God saw her, and heard her in her time of sorrow and trouble and despair. God will hear you, and God will hear me. Join next week. We'll look at the prayer of Job, who said many more words about God than he ever said to God. And there's a lesson to learn there as well. We'll talk to you next week. Thanks for watching this. Goodbye.